Welcome to Your Questions Answered, and you've been sending us in your questions about the heat wave, and to answer them, hopefully, we've got Dr. Dan Mitchell, who's Professor of Climate Change at the University of Bristol, Dr. Isabel Braithwaite, Clinical Doctoral Fellow in Public Health at UCL, and Dr. Neil Maxwell, Environmental Physiologist at the University of Brighton, all keeping relatively cool, I am hoping, this afternoon. Thank you very much for joining us to answer the questions. So let us start off then with the first question, which comes from Jessica Rowland, who is 17 years old, and it's a simple question. How long will the heat wave last for? I mean, we've been talking to our weather forecasters about that all day, but maybe Dan, you could answer this, maybe not precisely in terms of this week, but are we going to see many more of these heat waves recurring year after year, summer after summer, and maybe just getting hotter and hotter?
Sure, well, yeah, so this heat wave will start to cool after Tuesday, and but actually this entire summer, so the rest of July and August, are set to be very hot. Set to be hotter than average. So although it might technically not be a heat wave for the rest of summer, we're certainly expecting extremely hot temperatures. This is a trend we're expecting to see increase in the future. It's definitely increased already over the past 50 or so years. We know climate change contributes to this trend, and we know it's the leading order contributor. So yes, more of these heat waves, unfortunately.
We've been talking about climate change for so long, but now we're sort of, many people starting to see it and to feel it really for themselves.
Yeah, exactly. 10, 20 years ago, we talked about climate change as a sort of globally averaged thing. Now we're talking about real impacts. So we're talking about how climate change impacts the wildfires we're seeing in Spain, and Portugal, and France. We're talking about the actual mortality counts of people or animals. We're talking about ecosystem loss. We can really detect these sort of impacts within climate change now.
All right, Dan, thank you. Now, a couple of practical questions that I'm going to put to Neil and to Isabel, and it's just about how to keep cool, really. This is from S. Wilson in Nottingham. Is it worth wearing a damp cloth to keep the body cool? And also, I mean, generally, how do you keep cool? Isabel, maybe you first. What's your best advice on how to keep the body cool in these extreme weather conditions?
Yeah, sure, thank you. So I think a damp cloth can be helpful, definitely, particularly, if it's got cool water on it, because you get the effect of evaporation. So the head, the neck, the wrists, the feet and ankles, they're quite helpful places to try and cool down to start with. Spritzing the body, or kind of putting a little bit of water on your clothes or your skin, that can be quite a helpful thing to do to cool off. Something that people don't necessarily always think about, but which does make a big difference. And I think in this country, perhaps that's something we can actually really learn from other countries that are much more accustomed to dealing with hot temperatures, is how to keep our environments cool, our homes cool. So there's a lot of advice online about this, but I think it's not that well known. And I think one of the things people can do is to keep their homes, windows open when it's cool at night and in the early morning. Try and get a draft going if possible, a bit of a through ventilation, but then to actually shut those windows and the curtains if possible to keep that cooler air from the morning in and not be sort of letting the warm air come into the home, so that you try and keep that home environment as cool as possible, rather than just, once it starts getting to 38 or whatever outside, you don't just let that 38-degree air come in. So that can be a really helpful thing to do, that sometimes I think we haven't really learned. A lot of my family and friends, I've been trying to encourage them to do that. And when they do, they say they find it actually does make a difference. Eventually it might warm up depending on the insulation of your home, but it can be a really helpful thing.
Yeah, I think that's probably everyone's instinct, is just to leave the windows open all day, and that's not necessarily the right thing. That's not the right thing to do.
Do open them again.
Yeah. All right, Isabel, thanks very much. Neil, now, as an environmental physiologist at the University of Brighton, what was your advice to people in terms of keeping cool around the home as well? and it may be in their offices and other buildings that they might be into. What sort of thing should they be doing?
Well, I try and keep the mantra, start cool, stay cool, and then sleep cool. So you want to start cool by, you might have a cool shower in the morning. So rather than having your hot shower, which you might be typically doing, having a cool shower, not a cold shower, but a cool shower, will start you where you're not having a rise in core temperature. But I think there are a number of different methods you can use. And for me, trying to cool your hands and your feet are key areas that can help cool the body. We have these certain blood vessels in these parts of the body that allow us to exchange heat very well. So we can cool the hands, for instance, and it can send that cool blood back to the heart, which it can circulate around the rest of the body. Now, one really good way to do that is through ice pops. And ice pops allow you to cool from the outside in, but also cool from the inside out. So you cool by having your hands cooled by holding the ice pop, but obviously you're eating it, and the temperature, the change that takes place within your stomach actually absorbs heat by in terms of the ice that is being melted. So for me, I'm always recommending people to have ice pops that they can hold on to and eat.
All right, that sounds good advice, Neil. Thank you. I think I've broken all these rules already, actually. I had a hot shower this morning and left all the windows open through the day. So I've learned something myself. Let's go to another question. This is from 21-year-old Jerry, who's in Dorset, who's asking, why do record temperatures tend to be in London rather than more southerly latitudes such as Dorset? Maybe we'll ask Dan that one. I don't know if you've got an answer to that. It's difficult to answer, but what would you say to that, Dan?
Yeah, so that's quite a well-known thing, actually. It's called the urban heat island effect. And that is simply a city is much better at trapping heat than the rural areas. And in the UK in particular, that's a real issue because our cities are not well designed. They're sort of built over millennia. They're often built around a resource or around defending off the French or something like that. So they're not designed to be efficient.
Sorry for pausing that there, everyone. I would have thought, this is just my general view. I mean, I'm not a scientist or a doctor or whatever, but I would have thought that the reason that cities might have been hotter than, say, the countryside would have been because there's buildings and there's people going around, more bodies, because obviously bodies generate heat. I mean, in this flat where I live just now, it's just me, I live alone. Had there been 4 or 5 people in here, it would be warmer, than what it is just now. I mean, it doesn't feel like it can get any warmer. It's 29 degrees here just now. We saw 31 when I had to pop out to get some more refreshments earlier on. And if anything, that's only going to get warmer tomorrow. And there'll be more videos going up tomorrow. Maybe not quite as many as there was today. I might relax it a little bit more tomorrow, but there'll certainly be some going up anyway.
Cooling. So some of the American cities, for instance, are built in grids and the air can flow much more freely in those cities. So that trapping of the temperature means that the temperatures rise faster in a city than the surrounding areas. It's also to do with the sort of materials used in those cities. But some cities in, say, Southern Europe, they'll paint their buildings white, which will make them more reflective, and that'll combat some of this effect.
All right, let's ask Isabel the same question. I don't know if you got the answer to that or an answer.
Yeah, I mean, very much what Dan said. A lot of the things that contribute to the urban heat island effect, you have things like sort of tarmac and the materials that we make buildings out of really help sort of trap heat. They absorb heat and then they're radiating that back out into the atmosphere. And so there's sort of the temperature of the city is a couple of degrees often warmer than the surrounding countryside. And I think, being nearer to a coast is helpful in terms of people being able to kind of cool off and having a bit more breeze. Greenery is a really important measure when we're thinking about kind of climate adaptation and helping people stay cool. So people might have seen some of these images circulating on social media of how much cooler streets are under big shady trees than when it's just glaring sunshine down on tarmac. And I think that is something, you know, not in the short term, but in the long term, that we can actually start to think about in our local areas is how do we help create much greener urban, you know, towns and cities so that we get all of those benefits of cooling, cleaner air, flood protection and things. And I think that is something which probably contributes to why the countryside tends to be a bit cooler as well.
All right, thank you. Although actually, having said that question about London, but in fact the record for the UK was in Cambridge in 2019, 38.7 degrees Celsius. That may be broken. And the record in Wales, we were just reporting, has been broken. Gorgethan is where we've just seen that record broken in Wales. Gorgethan reaching 35.3 degrees Celsius so far. Let's go to Hashim, who's 15 in Chorley, who is asking, will schools close because of this current heat wave? Isabel, another question to you, if you don't mind. Again, probably not in a position to give a comprehensive answer on that, and of course, term is ending anyway.
So yeah, I mean, obviously I can't speak for every school in the country. I'm aware of some schools in London where I am that are either closing or they're closing early because they're just too concerned about the temperatures that they know they're going to be reaching and that not being safe. But obviously there's complexity in that because the homes that those children live in are not necessarily going to be safe temperatures either. So I think people are a bit stuck between a rock and a hard place, and sending young children home at 1 p.m. on a day like today doesn't feel very safe either, especially when the mayor's sent out a warning not to be doing anything but essential travel. So I think it really does show the importance of properly acting on climate change in terms of both reducing emissions and prioritising adaptation. I think some schools are closing. I don't think it's all of them, from my understanding, but I think it shows us that we're going to be facing these things more and more in the future, and we need to take this issue really seriously because it's a very real health crisis and it's only going to be getting worse.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, this is going to happen summer after summer, clearly, and could well have implications for our education system. Neil, this is one for you, I think, from Jane Ware. How can you look after babies in this extreme heat? And also mentioning Jane Ware, she says that babies in pushchairs are often covered in sheets to keep the sun off them. This puts the child into a mobile oven. What would you say about how to look after babies and very young children in this weather?
Yeah, absolutely right. It's like a little microenvironment in a pram, and so I think the padding around the pram, or even in cots, I think needs to be removed so that there is less insulation for the babies. You're right in terms of, for not just babies but young children, they don't have the cues to pick up that they're getting over too hot, whereas adults are good at perceiving the temperature. Actually, children, and actually even go to the other end, elderly, they're not very good at picking up that they're thirsty or they're how comfortable they are. And so that leads them to incurring heat illnesses more readily than adults. So I think part of it is, again, a lot of it is common sense. It's trying to not have the young child or the baby with too many clothes on. You might be wanting to have an extra feed so that more fluid is being taken on, but don't be surprised if they don't finish the bottle all in one go as they might normally be doing. You want to be trying maybe not to hold them as much, because obviously there's going to be conductive heat gain, so the heat is going to be transferred from the parent over to the baby or the young child, and it's trying to just use methods that we might typically use with adults as well. So thinking about cooling, how can we use a cool bath rather than a warm bath, which we might normally do with a baby at night? What about a cold bath? Think about the room that they're going to sleep in. Which is the coldest room within the house? And points that have been raised earlier about trying to reduce the temperature in the house. Well, that will help if you can identify which room is probably the coolest, which will help the baby in terms of their sleep. I think the other thing is to make sure that you know a bit more about some of the signs to look out for. Obviously, babies and sometimes young children, they won't be able to express when they're not feeling well, other than maybe crying. And it could be from changing a nappy that you find that actually it's dry and it shouldn't be dry. I would normally have a fuller nappy on a more regular basis. So it's trying to pick out those cues. They may vomit, they may have be clammy in their and hot to touch. Obviously, some parents have temperature monitors that they can use as well.
Okay, I'm going to cut you off there because we've got loads more questions to get through. Isabel, can you maybe try and answer this one? I know you're not a vet, but this is from Ella in Nottingham. How do we keep our pets cool in these very, very hot conditions at the moment? I guess similar sort of advice?
Yeah, I mean, I think with dogs, you know, it's not just about the thing that I think is more widely known in terms of not leaving them in hot cars, you know, not being really, really careful about those closed environments, but actually it's also walks can be really dangerous for dogs. They can't deal with heat at all well, so you need to be very, very cautious about that and basically avoid exertion except at very much cooler times of day. Help them in terms of kind of dousing them with cool water, all of similar kinds of things to help them cool down if they do overheat. You could use things like paddling pools to help cool them off, and that works with children and with dogs. Spritzing of kind of water if they're, you know, and cool food that's been in the fridge can be helpful, or a bit like, you know, the kind of ice bully idea. So some of those things, I think, keeping a close eye basically and watching out that they're coping, that their temperature's not rising, that they're not showing signs that they're really stressed by the heat. And, you know, with the baby, if they're kind of potentially at risk of heat exhaustion, they might be a bit kind of floppy, a bit sleepy, because they might not really be able to kind of communicate that with you. And you might sort of see some of those things with a pet as well. And that's a sign that you really need to get them somewhere cool. You need to rehydrate them. You need to bring down their body temperature quite quickly. And if that's not happening, if they're not starting to come back to their normal self and start to feel better in about 30 minutes, then that means they're at risk of that being progressing to heat.
All right. Okay, I'm just going to squeeze in a last question, and it's about, back to Dan actually, about climate strategy. Basically, is the climate strategy at the moment enough to stop future heat waves like the one we're seeing at the moment, Dan?
Well, unfortunately not. You know, we've already committed ourselves to over 1 degree global average warming. The problem is the timescales involved for climate change are much longer than the timescales we are used to thinking on. So if we emit CO2 today, some of that CO2 will stay in the atmosphere for up to 20,000 years. So we're committing ourselves to a very, very long timescale there. And that just doesn't work with political timescales. And so we, unfortunately, there's always something else more important for the government to act on, or so it deems it to be the case, whether it's a war or a Brexit or a change in Parliament. Climate change always comes in second, and that's the real problem. Is it's not the primary thing being addressed by governments, and it should be. And until we get into that mindset, we're going to struggle to really prevent these sort of heat waves getting even worse in the future.
Yeah, and just briefly, I mean, the questioner, Amanda Anderson, is saying, you know, do we need to be doing more in terms of educating young people about this in schools and colleges and universities? Just very briefly, Dan.
No, I don't think we do. I think young people are incredibly understanding of this problem. I think we need to just hammer it home to our politicians and almost make it a prerequisite of elections to say, right, what did you say you'd do on climate change? Oh, no, did you do that? Did you not do that? We need to hammer it home because they're the ones who are going to drive the innovation that we need to solve this problem. Okay,
very good to hear from you. Dr. Dan Mitchell, Professor of Climate Change at Bristol University, Dr. Isabel Braithwaite, Clinical Doctoral Fellow at Public Health at UCL, and Dr. Neil Maxwell, Environmental Physiologist at the University of Brighton. Many thanks to all of you for your expertise in answering our viewers' questions on the heat wave. Speaking of which, let's find out more about it and the forecast from Matt Taylor.